Now please welcome on stage a lady who is a BAFTA-nominated producer, filmmaker and academic, whose work spans original IP development, film business education and practice-led research. She is the founder of No Password Required, an initiative mapping globally majority-led film production companies in Europe and an annual mini-market supported by the BFI and FDA, connecting these companies with international sales agents and distributors. Please welcome Victoria Thomas. Hello, good to see you. Is it okay?
Okay. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I think it's just midday. My name is Victoria Thomas, and I am representing ARTEF. So just make sure I can use that. Right. Okay, so I am representing ARTEF. I don't know how many of you have heard of ARTEF or read the report that was released at Gothenburg Film Festival this year, but if you haven't, it's available for download at www.artef.org. So today we've launched a main character, which is it's equivalent to if you were familiar with the Blacklist in America. So it's going to be an annual list of unproduced screenplays, but specifically for European screenwriters. And so this came from a series of think tanks that ARTEF did last year, and which was a year-long, started off at the BFI London Film Festival. And we did a series of think tanks where we were talking about European cinema, European films, and we brought together different people from around the value chain. And that is largely because a lot of the systems that we use today in Europe for films in pretty much every European country, which is why everybody loves to co-produce with Europe, is backed by government and public funding. But of course, a lot of those systems came after World War II, and it was pretty much because of the World War II priorities. But of course, since World War II, a lot has happened, specifically the internet, which did not exist at the time, and the way people write or consume stories have changed. And so the question is are the systems for today, are they reflective of 2026, or is it still the post-World War II priorities? And so we did about 25 roundtables, and we brought people together from across the value chain, writers, producers, broadcasters, film funds, streamers, sales agents, award bodies, festival programmers. And we didn't ask them to define a European story. We asked what sort of stories are we telling about Europe today, and also what sort of stories are we celebrating. And one observation that kept coming up was that all the producers and all the writers said, it's always the same stories that are being told. We have all these amazing stories about our European experience that nobody's interested in. But at the same time, all the funders were saying, we want to support different types of stories, but they're not being submitted to us. And so one of the things that we wanted to ask was, if the writers are saying they have different stories, and if the institutions and the festivals are saying, we want to show different stories, why do we still have this gap? And so we decided to do some research because, of course, for us academics, we believe that the data does not lie. So we thought we would look at the stories themselves that are being told, and then we'll see whether or not there are any patterns. I'm probably going to contradict two panels ago where they talked about some of the sort of stereotypes and patterns. And so we wanted to see whether there were any patterns that were repeatedly visible or whether there was any that was absent. And so we decided to look at 5 years of the European Film Awards. The reason why we chose the European Film Awards is because it's the closest we could find to a pan-European celebration. So the question was, what are we celebrating across Europe? And of course, we also looked at TV and streaming because, of course, today we cannot not talk about streaming. So we looked at the fiction category, the EFA, for both the best film and the discovery category. And then we looked at documentaries, and then we looked at TV and streaming, which was beyond the film festival circuit. And this is kind of what we found. I have to stress that this is only for the past 5 years, so it's not fully exhaustive. We just wanted to look at a pattern. And so this is what we found. I don't think anybody would be surprised, but in the past 5 years for the EFA fiction, it was dominated by France. And even though there are 52 countries in Europe, 39 countries were completely invisible. Only 13 countries appeared. The majority of them were in Western Europe, and 15 out of 25 films that were nominated were from France, and 3 of 5 films that won Best Films were from France. And every year, without fail, every Palme d'Or winner appeared in the Best Film nominees for the EFA. But then if you look at the discovery category, which is where the new directors show up, we saw more countries. So there were 29 films that were nominated across the 5 years. There were 24 countries represented, and the majority of the selections were from Locarno. So what we saw was that at the discovery level, there was way more diversity in countries than the best film level, which then raised questions about which countries, which directors is the industry allowing to progress. Then we looked at, within fiction, most times for a lot of the stories were very local. It was pretty much looking at a specific European country's experience. And then when we looked at the same films, but when they looked beyond Europe, the story was always about borders, conscience, values, and the history of intervention. But also what was interesting was that in those stories, that was the only time we saw actors of color, and they were always positioned as foreign, and we never really saw actors of color within Europe, or the largest European minority, which is Roma. Then we went to look at documentary. And in documentary, the gaze was wider, but it's not wide. So it's 25 documentary films across 5 years. There were 26 countries. Again, it was led by France, but this was actually the space where we also saw a lot of Central and Eastern European countries. But again, most of the topics there were about conflict or war. And so the European Film Awards was really just sort of telling us what European cinema chooses to celebrate. But of course, it doesn't mean that that's the only place where European stories are being told. So we then looked at TV and streaming, and also the films from the awards circuit that found audiences via streaming. And so only 24% of those films actually reached mass audiences across the 5 years, and the remaining 19 pretty much stayed within the art house circuit, or they had very limited digital distribution. But when we looked at streaming, we realized that actually Europe was dominating. 43% of the global streamer spend is actually on European content, and it's actually more than North America and Asia and Pacific combined. And these were the kind of themes that we saw, and was very different to what we saw in the EFA, which was mostly introspective dramas. So we saw the institution under pressure, the community with its own codes, the outsider in elite spaces, and the interior crisis of self. But all of this also represented patterns that were coming from very specific regions. However, the most commercial genre that came from this was crime and thrillers. I think somebody said earlier that romantic comedies traveled, but actually when we looked at the data, it was crime thrillers that were doing the well globally, and that's what the streamers were spending on, and they were relying mostly on European countries. And the dominant countries on the streaming, in TV and in TV as well, overlap with what we saw at the EFA. It was mostly the Western European countries and the Nordics. So we've got France, Germany, Spain, UK, and the Nordics. But also what we saw was that the countries that are absent in film were also absent in TV and streaming, in terms of the most popular shows. And so in TV streaming, what we saw was that Western Europe authors and the CE is present, but how? There was a recurring theme, and this was the baddie from the East. So across the Scandinavian crime, German crime, British crime series, Central and Eastern European and Balkan characters pretty much always appear consistently as criminal infrastructure. It was either the Bulgarian trafficking network, the Albanian mob, the Romanian crew, the Serbian enforcer. So what we saw was Western Europe investigating and Eastern Europe being investigated. And so Streaming and TV in a lot of ways expands the landscape. We're not just seeing art house dramas, but we're seeing very similar patterns in who is dominating and who is being talked about and in what tone. And so, yes, so across all the three lenses, whether we look at documentary, whether we look at fiction, whether we look at streaming, it's the same picture that we see. Western Europe dominates. Central and Eastern Europe appear more in documentary than in fiction, and when they appear, it's a pattern. It's historical, it's crisis-driven, or it's pain-centered. And then in streaming, when we see CE characters, they appear through Western European lenses. And then if Europe looks across its borders, it's usually always about intervention, conscience, or immigration. And so if we then take the countries separately, we also saw a recurring pattern in how the countries present themselves. So if we look at Western Europe, it was always about power. What should I do? How should my powers be used? It was always about institutions, mostly about authority, and mostly about ethics. The Nordics were always reflecting. Who am I? How should I live? And so it was more about intimacy, emotional inheritance, and selfhood. Central and Eastern Europe, it was how do I survive? What do we inherit? It was a lot of history, a lot of borders, it's a lot of post-war reckoning. And in the South, it was what binds me to place, family, or history. And so the conclusion that we drew from this, and again, bearing in mind that this was just a small sample for 5 years that we looked at, is that across the three lenses, whether it's documentary, whether it's fiction, whether it's TV and streaming, different parts of Europe have been assigned or they have accepted specific questions, to be asked and to be explored on screen. It could be a subconscious pattern. It could also be that something has worked. Therefore, we all keep on looking for more World War II dramas from Poland. And so, and we are not actually saying that these stories should not be told. By all means, I'm British. I'm not from the monarchy, but I'm also not from Top Boy. I've never lived in the castle. I've never lived in the hood. But my Britain is missing. And I'm not saying they shouldn't tell more stories about the Queen or more stories about gangs in South London. The question is, are there more stories that we can tell? So what we think is that there's a massive gap between the dominant narratives that we're seeing and the wider ones. And I think that's why we had the disconnect when we did the roundtables and people were saying, we have stories that we want to tell, and but they're not commissioning us. And then the institutions are saying, we want to tell the stories, but they're not applying. And so that's where main character sits. So it's an open call. It opens on the 15th of July, which I think is next Wednesday. And it's a pan-European call for unproduced fiction screenplays. For the first edition, the screenplay has to be in English. I know somebody mentioned language earlier. But of course, we also have to think about the capacity. And this is the first time that we're doing it. And we're just saying to the audience, what is your European story? So it will run across 3 stages. All of the entries have to be anonymous so that there's no bias. The jury across the 3 stages will be different. At the first stage, we're only looking at the logline and the short synopsis. The second stage, the long synopsis. And at the third stage, the screenplays will be read. And then 12 screenplays will be selected, and that will be announced at Göteborg Film Festival in 2027. And so if you are a writer in the room or producer, I guess this is your time. If you think your stories are not being told, the question is, what is your European story? Any questions or comments? I'm happy to share the presentation, but I think we're doing a white paper, but this is just a summary of what came up.
Okay. No questions? Victoria, that was great. Thank you very much. Thank you.